At what point were you pretty certain that you were going to Southeast Asia, that you were going to a real fight?
As soon as I saw orders to F-4 Phantoms, I knew that, and particularly since I was going to the West Coast, we knew that we would be taking part in the Vietnam conflict.
This P-47 and this A-20 are just two of the Lewis Air Legends airplanes. Rod Lewis has 24 legendary aircraft in his collection, mostly warbirds, and each one has stories to tell that could fascinate us through the day and on into the night. Rod is committed to maintaining and sharing the history of these airplanes and their roles in protecting our country. Those stories and about the pilots who flew these planes are coming up. And speaking of pilots, there are pilots, there are really good pilots, and then once in a while a pilot comes along who is so extraordinary, both as a pilot and as a person in the air and on the ground, that it's impossible to adequately describe that person. There is a man who fits that description.
Oh, I see you spotted the name on the plane. Bob Hoover. He used to be a test pilot, one of the best. Today, he's manager of customer relations for North American's Los Angeles division, and he's the man who demonstrates this plane. Well, here he comes now. You know, he flies this plane in a business suit and without a parachute. Hi, Bob. We've just been admiring this beauty of yours.
Beauty she is, and she flies like a dream. Tell you what, folks, climb in with me now, and let's see what we can do.
In the air in World War II, he fought to save our country from those who would try to take away our freedoms. On the ground, he has committed himself to our country's values and has always reflected those values in his own daily life so that we never forget who we are as Americans and how so many have given their lives to keep America safe and free. He soloed at 16, but then had to teach himself aerobatics to overcome air sickness. A few years later, in Air Corps primary pilot training, he was so good at aerobatics that his commander had him teach all of his instructors aerobatics. He flew combat in Europe, was taken prisoner in Germany. He escaped and commandeered a German Focke-Wulf 190 and flew it to Holland. After the war, as a test pilot, he flew hundreds of different models of airplanes. One flight, October 14, 1947, he flew chase on the Bell XS-1. That was man's first successful supersonic flight when the pilot lived to tell about it. Yes, he took that famous photo of the bullet-shaped rocket plane breaking the sound barrier. And who can ever forget the first time they saw Bob fly his Mustang and Shrike Commander in air shows around the world? Jimmy Doolittle introduced him as the greatest stick-and-rudder pilot who ever lived.
I love it. My name is Connie Bolin. I am the founder and now the chairman of Warbirds in Review, so I welcome all of you to this session of the 2016 Warbirds in Review. My husband and I founded this and had this brilliant idea about 16 years ago, and it has evolved to this. Today, I'm really pleased to have the Sleeping Dog Productions team as part of our group here. Kyle Guyette is my right-hand man, and her husband Scott is the videographer and the editor-producer, the all-person here that makes this happen. For those of you who are here and have friends at home who would like to see this, it's available on flyingondemand.com. It is wonderful to be able to live stream this. I think we went to 64 countries last year. I'm sure we're doing at least that well this year. I think I need more bleachers next year, especially for Mr. Hoover. Okay, we'll work on that. We do work off of donations and sponsorship. And speaking of that, Scott's Miracle Grow Company is our sustaining sponsor, so I thank Jim Hagedorn, my personal thanks to him and his friendship and the support that he gives us to make all of this possible. Additionally, we have Fagan Fighters World War II Museum from Granite Falls, Minnesota, an absolutely wonderful museum, and two very special people, Ron and Diane Fagan, that also support us, Jelly Belly Candy. And we could not do this without the owners of the aircraft. Lewis Air Legends owns this beautiful P-47. You were expecting possibly an A-20. They were also expecting to have their A-20 here. Unfortunately, about 115 miles out, their right engine decided it did not want to perform properly. So they are stuck in Illinois. But Rod, I spoke with Rod yesterday, and he said, what do you want for next year? What do you think? Spitfire, a this, a that? Rod, whatever you would like to bring, it will be wonderful. Maybe, he said, well, we'll get the A-20 there next year. You can look for that. But Lewis Air Legends, Cavanaugh Flight Museum, all the personal one owner or one aircraft owners are always very supportive. So our thanks to them. And at this time, I would like to introduce our president of EA Warbirds of America, Harold Cannon, and he has a special presentation that he would like to read for you here. Harold, thank you.
There
you can be me.
Okay. Thanks, Connie. And I should mention that this is my last year as president of Warbirds. Connie is our president-elect, and she takes over on Monday. So she's done a great job here. She'll do a great job there as well. She tasked me with finding a P-47 veteran to talk today. I don't tell many people this, but my day job is a neurosurgeon. That's how I put gas in airplanes. And I opened an exam room door about 3 months ago and met a P-47 veteran, and that's him up on the screen. This guy's 92. He broke his back carrying a TV to upstairs bedroom. He is tough as nails and sharp as a tack. And I went to work on Ray and said, listen, I've got a little speaking gig for you. And Ray talked about it, and he thought about it, and he said yes, and he thought about it some more. And put the letter up, guys. And then he wrote this letter that I'd like to share with you. Dear Dr. Cannon, it's not without some pain that I write this letter. First, let me say I'm very thankful for the many kindnesses you've shown me, and I have respect for you. I must decline your offer to have me participate in the air show. My reasons for this decision are almost overwhelming. My tour of duty in Europe was the most ordinary and uneventful as a fighter pilot could have. I'm just not the person you need for the event. A simple guy like me would be an embarrassment to himself and to you. Also, my condition and fatigue for both me and my son are a concern for both of us. Also, your offer to expend time and expense for our transportation and lodging would leave me with a guilty feeling that I don't enjoy. I and my family have discussed this matter in thorough detail, and while it's an opportunity that's so generous and beyond imagination, we must decline. While my heart wishes much success for both you and the air show, logic tells me no, and I've given my family my word, and I must remain at home where I belong. I remain sincerely yours, Raymond Shurick. P.S. I hope our paths will frequently cross, but not in a professional manner. That's Ray back in the day. This guy is no bigger than a minute. He's fighter pilot size. He is an American hero. His P-47 was named Dirty Red. There were 2 redheads in his squadron. He was from Kentucky like me, and they just assumed that guys from Kentucky don't bathe very much. And that's Dirty Red in flight. Ray had an uneventful tour in Europe. He actually blew up a bunch of Nazi locomotives. One of them he got so target fixated on, it blew up. I got to hold a piece of that locomotive in my hand. It came home in the wing of his P-47. His squadron commander made him fly home alone with no cover because he said it was his own darn fault. That's Ray's Distinguished Flying Cross. Completely uneventful. And do we have any more? Yeah, that's the part of the locomotive sitting on a chair in Ray's living room. And I think we're going to see a P-47 throttle quadrant that he's still got as well. I think Ray's tour was pretty dang eventful. And I think his modesty typifies the modesty of the greatest generation. It shows us what Americans can do. It shows us what we can do today and what we can do again if we don't forget. And not forgetting is indeed what Warbirds is all about. That's one of Ray's friends. He lived through it. He almost drowned in gasoline, but he never flew again. And I don't think anyone could blame him. Ray's time in Europe was not all completely work. He did get around and do a little sightseeing as things calmed down. And I think the last picture is Ray done by an artist. Tourists still do that today, right? So anyway, as we think about this, we need to think about what these gentlemen did, and we need to remember them, and we need to remember what our country can do.
Please welcome Bob Hoover.
Right out in front here.
Yeah, wait. That's great. Perfect. Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Morning, Bob. On April 2nd this year at Uver Hadzi Smithsonian Air and Space, the second bronze life-size statue of an aviator was unveiled at Uver Hadzi, and it was of Bob Hoover. The first and the only other life-size statue at Smithsonian is Billy Mitchell. So Bob is in rare company, and so is Billy Mitchell. Bob, good morning.
My dear friend, what a treat to be with you.
And what a treat to be with you again as well. Good morning. Bob, what does that mean to you? When we were there that night at Uver Hadzi in April, and to have that statue of you, and you've already got your two airplanes there, the Aero Commander and the Mustang, are in the museum. What do those honors mean to you coming from Smithsonian and the aviation community?
Well, the truth of the matter is, there are far more people that deserve this than I ever was capable of receiving it. But I am tickled to death because so many people believed in what I did and why I did it, and they donated an enormous amount of money, and I guess it got into the real big dollars, and all of the money over and above the cost of the statue went to the museum. And I've done a lot of those kind of things that I'm really proud of, and if you don't mind my bragging a little bit, I made $1,013,000 out of one movie at the premiere only, and the people who invested in the movie said, Bob, we made that donation and it's your money. What do you want to do with it? I said, I want to put it into aviation, and I donated the money to the Embry-Riddle Air College and for scholarships, and I now had some classes graduating. And I'm very proud of it.
Bob, thinking here we are to honor every year for a week honoring veterans. We have over 2 million veterans now in the United States, American veterans. When you think about our veterans today, what goes through your mind?
Well, I can respond to that easily. I have some very dear friends. I don't know how many of you know Mike Herman, but he is a very dear close friend of mine, and he uses his private business jet every weekend that he can. He goes to a Veterans Administration hospital and finds some wounded soldier from one of our war days, and he says, "When was the last time you saw your family?" And the young man will say, "It's been a very long time. I don't have the money, or I'm too crippled to go visit him, or I can't get to see my family." He flies them from wherever they live, or the veteran takes him to his home, goes back and picks him up 3 days later, after, we'll say on Sunday, and brings him back to the hospital. He has organized other people who have a private business jet and do just exactly what Mike has done, and I think he ought to get a big recognition.
Mike Herman.
Let's give it to him.
And Mike, by the way, was the gentleman who came
Mike
out.
Herman.
Mike came out with us just a few minutes ago. Bob, as many times as we've spoken and we've heard stories, and most of the people here know a lot of the stories about your career, but there are certain little details that sometimes get missed. And if you would, let me take you to a couple of those stories and try to recall some of the details. You heard in the video ahead about the fact, Bob was shot down. He was 16 months a prisoner of war in Stalag 1 in northern Germany. He escaped. There was a recently deserted German airfield. He was able to get in the Focke-Wulf 190 and flew it with German markings, mind you, of course, across Germany to land in Holland. You landed in Holland in a field. Bob, how is it that you didn't get shot when you landed in Holland flying a German airplane?
Well, I really had a problem. Germany, when they retreated all across North Africa, when we would take over an airfield, we couldn't land on it, beautiful runway, because the Germans, when they deserted after we were pushing them back, they would put landmines in the runway. And when our forces came in, poof, and we didn't have to do that but about once or twice, and we decided we don't land on an airfield that we have recovered from the Germans. And on my escape, I've got to just back up and say, it was the dumbest thing anybody ever did. The war was 2 weeks from being over. The Germans were deserting, and I was so in the mind of escaping, and I had done nothing but try to escape from the day they got me, and I could talk to you for hours about the things I did and experienced. And to sum it all up, I was beaten up on many occasions for my attempts at escape when they recaptured me, and I never gave up going for it. And I got my inspiration from a colonel who was shot down before me, and he had heard from, he was a wonderful fighter pilot.
Russ Spicer?
Russ Spicer, one of the finest people you've ever met. And Russ was captured, and he was rescued. He was shot down in a P-47, as a matter of fact, and he landed in the water, got in his life raft. It was the winter time on the Baltic Sea, and by the time they recovered him, he had gotten up on the beach, and he was found unconscious by the Germans. And they brought him into our prison camp, and he stood up and said, "Gentlemen, General Patton, I've just learned, has gone out in front of all of his supply supports." And he had I think it was almost 1,000 men. And the Germans realized that Patton had outrun his supply forces for ammunition, everything. He was so far ahead of the troops coming in. And the Germans got smart, and they pulled a pincer and closed him in. So 1,000 men were right there captured. And the Germans came in and shot every one of them. 2 of the people survived, and they received they recovered enough to where they brought them into the same hospital that I ended up in a prison camp, and I had a chance to visit with him.
How much of an inspiration was Colonel Spicer to you?
He was, he was like Jesus to me. Somebody I wouldn't even talk to. I was only a flight officer, but when he made his speech and said what had happened, he said, "Remember, these are your enemy. I don't want to see a single person in this prison camp being friendly with the Germans or trying to be friendly." He said, "Just remember, they're your enemy." And boy, I was motivated by him. He was a leader, if there ever was one.
And even though General Eisenhower had spread the word, "Don't try to escape now, we're going to get you out here within a couple of weeks," but you did it anyway.
Yeah, but every time I would get into, I have to go with solitary confinement for trying to escape, and you don't have any daylight, and you don't know what day it is or anything. I ended up in the cell next to him, and he knew when the Germans were coming because we were on wooden planks in front of our cells, and you could hear them clanking. And so he would wait until the sounds were coming down, and he'd knock on the door and say, "Who's my neighbor?" And I told him I was a flight officer. And he said, "Well, young man, what did you do to get in here?" And I said, "Well, I attempted to escape again." And he said, "I want you to know you're one of my heroes." And he said, "When we get out of here, I'll never forget you." And every day he didn't know whether he was going to live or die because they were going to put him before the firing squad. And one of the great heroes in my life. And you know of him and heard of him, so
Sure.
He was a wonderful individual.
So you got in the ME-109, you got off, again with German markings, and you flew across Germany to Holland. How did you know you were in Holland?
Well, first of all, we went in we were starving to death. And we went into a farmhouse. I knocked on the door, and a lady answered the phone. And I asked her if she spoke English, and she said, meaning a little bit. And so we tried to talk to her, and I told her we were escaped prisoners and we were starving to death, and if she could give us something to eat, well, I'd like to leave a message that she had helped us. And so I wrote a note. She gave me some paper and a pencil, and I left a note saying that she had been helping us on our escape. And of course, we hadn't eaten eggs in a long, long time. That was really the first great breakfast I ever had. But she didn't read the note I left. And so after she fed us, I shook hands and thanked her. And my fellow that escaped with me, we hit the road. And we were walking down this dirt road that came out to this farmhouse. And she came out and she was holding the letter, the little note that I'd written with a pencil. And she was running and yelling, and I thought, oh my heavens, what's happened to the lady? And I ran back to meet her, and she had a pistol in her hand and cartridges. And she said, I just read the letter in broken English. She didn't speak too well. And I had said, she said to me, this will do you more good, I'm sure, than it will me. And she gave me the pistol and a whole bunch of cartridges to go with it for the bullets. Well, boy, we were in Fat City. We had bicycles now. So we stole the bicycles. And we drove we rode a lot of miles on those bicycles, but we had that gun for security for ourselves. And
So did you have reason to use the gun when you got to the airfield?
I did. We finally came to an airfield, and it was deserted, but there were still people there. But compared to where it really would have been a few weeks earlier. And airplanes were in revetments. And for those of you who are not familiar with revetments, that is a U-shaped buildup of rocks or anything like this. And they park airplanes in them, and it's open at one end, and over the top they have something like a tent structure, but it looks like trees from the air. And so that's what we did, as well as the Germans. We hid our airplanes under those kind of situations at airfields, and they're not seen by the reconnaissance airplanes that come over and find out how many enemy airplanes you got on a different airfield. It's hard to know. You couldn't tell. And so I went from revetment to revetment because the Germans had deserted so much that there were only a few of them walking around, and I saw the one come around, and I told my friend, whose name was Jerry Ennis, that I escaped with, I said, I'm going to put the gun on the next mechanic that comes by, and I could tell by the attire he had on, and mechanic suit, and I motioned him into the hangar with the gun like this, and he came over to the hangar, and we couldn't communicate. And my friend Jerry said, Bob, he said, I taught French in high school before I joined the service. I'm going to see if he can speak French. We clicked, and he spoke French, and he told the German, he said, I'm going to shoot you if you don't help Bob start the airplane. Well, the Fock-Wulf 190 was not foreign to me because Gus Lundquist, another friend of mine, who was a test pilot at Wright Field, was sent over to England to check out in all of the captured German airplanes that the British had. And he talked the general into letting him fly one mission because he wanted to fight, but he was stuck as a test pilot at Wright Field. He had checked out in all of these airplanes and just spent 10 hours flying a Focke-Wulf 190. And I found out that he had been at Wright Field, where I wanted to go after the war. And I went over and started visiting with him. He didn't want anybody to know that he was from Wright Field or what he'd done or anything. And it didn't get out to any people hardly at all. But he revealed to me that's where he was stationed. And I said, there's that Fock-Wulf airfield right near here, and we would see them fly over, and I said, I would sure like to know how to start that engine. And he said, well, I'll draw you pictures. And we'd get out in the dirt after we'd be counted every day, and he would sketch off where the instrument panel was, everything. Well, 8 months later, when I got out, I got in that 190 and I looked at everything, and I thought, gee whiz, I'm in a world of trouble. And I said, Jerry, we got to figure out some way to. The man that he put the gun I had brought into the compartment, he told him, he says, if you don't get that engine started and get him off the ground, you're dead. And boy, this guy started shaking, and boy, he turned pale white. And I got in the cockpit, and he helped me. And I thought I knew something about it, but it's been so long since Gus had checked me out. I didn't do anything. I just checked the engine, ran it up. I knew it was okay. It had a lot of bullet holes in it, but it was full of gas, so I knew that it was flyable.
So you didn't have a parachute? You didn't have a cushion?
I had nothing, and
Could you see over the? Could you see over the?
No, the problem was, this is the funniest thing. I didn't have a cushion. I didn't have a parachute, and so when I got in, I'm now, instead of sitting up like this, I'm now sitting here like this, looking out, and he got it started, and I thought, boy, there's still guys up in those gunroom sites around the field. I'm not going to taxi out. So I just ran the engine up until I got full power, released the brakes, straight out, and then up as steep as I could get. And then I thought, you are the dumbest aviator that ever flew. The war's almost over, and you idiot, you're trying to go in an airplane. What the hell are you accomplishing? And the answer is nothing. And so I was not proud of it. I don't mind telling you. And then I thought, boy, any young second lieutenant right out of flight training could have shot me right out of the sky. And I wouldn't have defended myself no matter what. And fortunately, there was a cloud deck at about 4,000 feet. And so I just got up to the edge of the cloud and level and stayed there. And I thought, if I see any American airplanes, I'll just duck up into the clouds and then wait a few minutes until maybe they quit looking and dive out and try to get free. I never had a problem. I never saw another airplane. But I went over many airfields, had full tanks of fuel, and I was headed for Holland because I wanted to see windmills to be sure that I was in favorable country, and they were on our side. Well, I got to Holland, saw the windmills, so now I felt safe, and I just couldn't find any place to land. But I had an open field. My gas tank was registering close to zero, and I thought, better get it on the ground while I've got control. And so I circled the little place. It looked like it was a pretty good field. So I put the gear down and landed. And when I got on the ground, I could see a ditch that I had not seen from the air. And I was headed right for it. And I could picture myself hitting the ditch, flipping upside down, being trapped there, and nobody would ever find me. Well, I ground looped. I just reached down and sucked up the gear, booted full rudder, and it skidded to a stop on its belly. And I sat there, there's nobody anywhere, and I thought, you are no question the dumbest pilot that ever lived. And so I sat there for a few minutes and said, what the heck are you going to do now? Well, I got out and didn't have to carry anything because I didn't have anything. And I headed for some trees because I'd seen a little dirt road on the other side. And I went into the trees and I was wondering, what if I was heading in the right direction. And all of a sudden pitchforks came at me from every direction. And they were all Dutchmen who had seen me land in the German airplane with swastikas on it. And they hated the Germans like you couldn't believe. And boy, they had pitchforks. And I put my hands up and kept pointing like that and yelling, American, America. Nobody could understand me. And we got on the other side of the trees, and I still had my hands up, and there was some dirt road there. And as the good Lord helped out, a truck from a British truck came by, and it had two men in it, and I was still holding my hands up, and I was waving them like that, and the vehicle stopped, and I said, I hope you can help me. I'm a Yank, and they think I'm a Kraut because I just left a German airplane over there in that field on the other side of the trees. They say, I see, old chap, pop in. Anyway, that's not a horror story. It's a stupid story. And for a year and a half, or maybe 2 years, I wouldn't tell that story to anybody in the world. I was so embarrassed and I felt so stupid about it. But all of a sudden, everybody tried to act like I'd done something great. I didn't do anything great. I did something very stupid. But my friend came to an air show, and he had read about it in the paper, and one of the little people that keeps people out of the crowd away from the airfield came over and he said, Mr. Hoover, there's a man over there that said he was in prison camp with you. And my narrator, who flew one of my airplanes from one place to the other, he said, God, Bob, there must have been 100,000 people in that prison camp. Every time we go to any air show, somebody comes out and says, he was there. And I said, well, they started out with 1,000 and ended up with 10,000 prisoners. And I got to be known by a lot of people, but he said, it looks like to me you must have been with 10,000s of people. That wasn't the case. But they wanted to interview him. And before I could shut him up, he started telling the story. And suddenly my embarrassment was coming out in front of the whole world. It's been there ever since. And I was no hero. I didn't do anything but be stupid. That's all there is to it.
Bob, P-47, this airplane behind you. Any memories of the P-47?
I've got some wonderful things to tell you. When I was one of those chosen to be the test pilot, the #1 test pilot on the Bell X-1 first rocket ship, and my friend Chuck Yeager was a maintenance officer in the flight test, but he had not been through any of the test pilot schools, and I had the assignment, and this is kind of interesting, I think, seriously interesting. We were flying P-80s, and I was testing an airplane that was in the research stage, and we had 3 of us on the thing, and we were now working towards breaking the sound barrier. Now, most people said, what in the world is the sound barrier? Well, it is a point, and it's a very technical thing, but I'm going to make it simple. Where the wings are attached to the fuselage on an airplane, when you get past 500 miles an hour, which is about 8/10 of a Mach number 1 is speed of sound. That's what we couldn't achieve, and we tried it. I flew P-40s and flew P-51s first, and I got the P-51 up to about, a little over 8/10, which is 500 miles an hour, starting out as high as you could climb, about 45,000. And with the P-47, the same thing. And the controls would stiffen up. It's called hysteresis. The forces of the wind will suck your elevators up, and you have a lot of wiring, and it's stretching, and it stretches, and suddenly the airplane has no control. You're sitting there, and the stick is in concrete until you slow down. So if you got over a certain speed, you had this. So that's why they called it a sound barrier, because, and that's hysteresis, well, the stretches of the cables, and then the air can do what it wants to. And if it sucks them up, which it does, and some of the tests I did with different airplanes, it sucks them up, then the airplane pulls a P-40 or P-39 at about 400 miles an hour. You're pitched up, because I had to do it with every type of airplane. And so there was the P-47. I used all the earlier airplanes that were not fast enough, but the P-51 and the P-47, I could actually get them to 500 miles an hour. And with 500 miles an hour on this airplane, I felt better in it, but it too would be stiffened up, and you aren't going anywhere. You're going in the direction you're pointed when you get up to 500 miles an hour. And so in my test program, there were 3 of us working on it, and the first one, we had a motor that was driving a piece of controls that were added on the tail. We were trying to break down this turbulence of airflow that kept you from going up to speed of sound. And what we did was we had an electric motor that drove a device we had put on the horizontal stabilizer back just where the elevators are at the hinge point. We put a flat plate. Said nobody knew they didn't have any research, but a flat plate about this wide that went the span from the fuselage out to the tip. And to pull that up was like putting your flaps up. And what they wanted us to do was to go out to whatever Mach number we could get. And with the P-47, I felt better in it than I did in the other airplanes. And this final day came along. First pilot was killed, and he got killed when the canopy came off when he was in a dive, and it dished into the cockpit, and we found his head and his helmet about, I'd say, 2,000 feet away from the wreckage. And there were 3 of us on that program, and I was the junior person, the youngest also. And the other fellow and myself said, it's far more risky than we considered it to be. And engineering were trying to figure out what to do next. And I said, well, I suspect that electric motor didn't have enough power, and he couldn't get it to go to the different ratchets that you had to go to get the thing elevated to get through compressibility. And so I said, why don't you put a big motor on it? And so they put a big motor on it, and second pilot lost the canopy, and his head came off. Same thing, found the wreckage, found the head.
Did this give you pause about continuing this program?
My turn next, and I thought, I don't think I like this job. But I said, let's make that stick manual. And this is where the B-47 really comes in. I said, put a stick over here, just back of the throttle quadrant, that goes all the way to the floor. There's a big steel pipe like this. And put the controls, and instead of the motor, I want to physically have this go all the way up telescoping until I could get to the top of the canopy. And if you look at the canopy, you can see how the shape is high here. It goes back like this. And I had that to go all the way up. And I could reach up then. I've had my both shoulders broken, so I can't raise my arms. But I'd raise it as high as I could. And then I could pull a little thing I had, and I could make it go a notch at a time. And so I did a lot of flights before the bad one, and I'd get it going, and I thought I had it made, and I was still not stuck at lower speeds. And so I kept working at it, and finally I got to where I could pull it, and my chase pilot said, Bob, you gotta pull out of that dive. You're running out of altitude. I said, I've done everything I can, and I don't know if I'm gonna make it or not. And so I finally got the ratchet to work, and it went to so many G's. Now look at this airplane. The wings buckled right at the fuselage. See where the gear goes into the well? Where the gear goes into the well, that's what holds the landing gear up. And the airplane, I was at 0.83, and that was just slightly over 500 miles an hour vertical. And I was about 9,000 feet. And I heard the loudest noise I'd ever heard, biggest explosion. I mean, it was just dynamite. And that's the last thing I heard was this horrible noise. And I was unconscious. And 15 minutes later, I had the airplane trimmed just right. When I went unconscious, I was unconscious because I pulled G's that were beyond human survival, actually, and nobody could figure out how I got away with it, but I guess I was stupid, and that must have been why. But
there's that word keeps coming up again, that
I was pulling so hard on the stick, and when those wings buckled, it was that terrible explosion, and the gear doors came off and took half of the tail on one side. And when I came to, I'd been out, my chase pilot said, I heard my name called, and I was like this in the cockpit, and I didn't know what had happened. And I kept thinking I was hearing somebody calling my name, and I thought, where am I, and what's going on? And finally I looked up, and I looked over, and I saw my chase plane there, just flying formation with me. And he said he'd been calling my name for 15 minutes before he saw any movement. And then he started talking to me and saying, you think you're okay? And I said, yeah, I said, I can't believe what I'm seeing. All these wings were sticking up like this. And I didn't have too much lift, it didn't seem to me, but it was flying and all by itself. I wasn't on the controls. And so then I took over the controls and felt it out, even with the tail, part of the tail missing. And he said, get out of it. He said, you can't land it. I said, I don't believe the gear will stand up and you could flip upside down and that'll be the end of you. Why don't you bail out? And I said, well, see if the gear wiggles when I boot the rudder and skid it a little bit. That'll tell you whether it's locked in its locked position. And he said, well, the gear doors are gone. And I said, well, you can see the wheels. And he said, they don't seem to be moving. And I said, well, that's good enough for me. He said, but you can still have the gear full. I said, if the gear's down, I'm going to try to land it. There's no problem at all. It did land. I had to land hot, though, because I didn't have enough elevator, but it worked out nicely, and I landed. And the airplane was totally destroyed. I mean, it was just a mess.
But you made it.
That's my horror story about the P-47. But it was a wonderful airplane in combat. It was right alongside the P-51.
Right. Bob, I have one more question, but before I ask you that, remind everybody a couple of things. Bob will be over in the bookstore after. He won't sign books. They're pre-signed, but you'd be welcome to have a picture taken with Bob. That's in the bookstore after we've completed our program. And also, where's Kyle? There's Kyle over here waving her hand. We have challenge coins for any of you from Warbirds this year. Any of you would like a challenge coin, just see Kyle after the program is over. Bob, last question. When you see the American flag all your life, what does that mean to you?
Shall I tell you a little short story?
Sure.
About here? One year I was over by my airplane waiting for my turn to take off. And there were some cars parked by all of the performing airplanes. And I drove up in my car and I was just waiting for my turn to fly. And the national anthem was being played. And there were some teenagers next to a car at another airplane that was one of the performers. And the national anthem was played and they didn't stand up. And I yelled, on your feet! And boy, it got a jump out of them. And they looked around where it come from. And I said, you heard me? And they stood on their feet, and when the national anthem was over, I walked over to them and I said, don't you know what that meant? And the answer was, I don't know. I said, that's the American flag, the red, white, and blue. That's what this country stands for. I said, you're supposed to stand up. Think how many people have died trying to keep that flag flying. And these teenagers looked around like this. And I said, just believe me. We live in the greatest country in the world, and you've got to respect it, and you've got to pass that along to others. Stand at attention every time you hear that. And the end of the story is, I no more than got that out of my mouth, and I saw a giant stand up on the other side of the car, and it was the father of the two boys. And I thought, oh man, he's going to hammer me right in the top of the head. Well, believe it or not, he came over and shook hands with me. Happy ending. Thank you. Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sam Bass and John Penny are going to do a walk around this airplane. If you want to learn more about the statistics about this P-47, thank you all very much. Bob Hoover. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, folks. My name is Sam Bass, and thank you, David. And we have this P-47 here, and John Penny is the pilot, and it's owned by Rod Lewis, and it's Lewis Air Legends, and that's in Texas, right?
Yes, it is, from San Antonio, Texas.
And John, tell us a little bit about this airplane as far as the specifications.
Well, the P-47 is a very, very rugged airplane. It's really kind of a airborne tank, if you will. It was one of the heaviest fighters designed and flown in World War II. It's powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine with a Hamilton standard prop. Develops 2,000 horsepower. 2,000 horsepower. The airplane has a top speed of 500 miles an hour indicated airspeed. And I've never flown it that fast, not as fast as Mr. Hoover has. But it was used, first flight was in May of 1941, and it went into combat late in 1942, primarily used initially as a long-range and medium-range escort for the bombers flying over Europe. But then when the P-51 came in as escort, it was relegated to a ground attack role for our troops in the 8th Air, over in Europe.
Well, what range did it have?
It could penetrate all the way with tanks on board, could go all the way to Berlin. So it was about 1,000 miles range.
Okay, now it's famous for its durability. Talk about its durability.
Oh, yes. You know, I've been privileged to fly the P-51 and the P-47 along with some other airplanes. But the P-51, if you get one bullet through the cooling system of that airplane, you're done. I've heard stories about P-47s that were over in the war over there that they got a cylinder shot off. One cylinder shot off the engine, and the pilots were able to limp back across English Channel and land safely in England.
And I understand that there have been pilots that actually just huddled behind the engine back there, and then they finally the 109s just gave up trying to shoot them down, and they just kept flying. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, the airplane was not as maneuverable as a 109 or the P-51 or the Spitfire. But this airplane could outdive any of those airplanes. So the 109 pilots had to figure that out pretty quick.
Okay, tell us about the turbocharger that's back in the back end of it.
The turbocharger, the air being used by the engine actually goes in a scoop right here in the bottom, and it goes all the way back to the turbocharger where there's a bump underneath the tail back there that you can see. And the turbocharger uses the exhaust gases that are routed back there also to spin up, just like you do in a turbocharged automobile.
What's that?
The challenge coin?
Then it compresses that air, brings it past a couple of intercoolers and on up into the carburetor. That whole mechanism, that's the reason why the belly of the P-47 is so deep. And that whole mechanism, the turbocharging mechanism, weighs 2,500 pounds. However, with that turbocharger, the P-47 was capable of climbing up to 40,000 feet and getting just about to 400 miles an hour at 40,000 feet. So that's pretty doggone impressive.
All right, now tell us about the armor. It's kind of like a tank, isn't it?
Oh, it's kind of like a tank. And this, I mean, in the history of Republic, it's kind of the precursor to the A-10, which is a tank killer, as you know. This has 8 50 caliber machine guns. The airplane could also carry 10 5-inch high velocity rockets. And it could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs, which was half of the bomb load of a B-17. So think about that.
All right, now, this airplane, of course, is made famous by Gabreski and some other Bob Johnson and that sort of. Tell us a little bit about Gabreski flying the airplane.
Well, people think of the P-51 as a Messerschmitt killer, the Focke-Wulf killer, and whatnot. Francis Gabreski was the highest scoring ace over in the 8th Air Force in Europe, and he shot down 28 airplanes with a P-47. And Robert Johnson documented 27 kills, but anecdotally, people think there was a tie between he and Gabreski.
All right, tell us about the color scheme on this particular airplane, paint scheme.
This color scheme, and I don't know who the name of the pilot, but this is an accurate paint scheme from the 8th Air Force from a pilot who flew over in the 8th Air Force over there.
So what outfit was it in?
I'm taking a hazy on that, I'm sorry.
Just make up something because they don't know the difference.
317th or something. I don't
How about the nose art? Tell us about the nose art.
Well, the nose art, that's what I was talking about, where it says balls out.
Okay, yeah.
We do have a historical picture of the pilot, and again, I don't recall his name, standing next to this airplane over in Europe in World War II.
Okay, now you've been flying this airplane for what, 10 years, is that correct?
I've been flying P-47s for 10 years.
And then you flew the 51 also?
Yes.
Now, what does it mean to you to bring this airplane so that these veterans, the World War II veterans are disappearing, but the Vietnam veterans and the Korean veterans, to see this airplane, and how emotional do they get when they see it?
Oh yes, it's an honor and a privilege to bring these airplanes to events where the veterans, who some of them are still with us, flew the airplanes, and for people who would have aspired to fly the airplanes can see them perform and fly. And every single one, they do get emotional. There's the other P-47 I'm privileged to be able to operate is up at Payne Field with the Flying Heritage Collection. That airplane is called the Tallahassee Lassie. It was the P-47 that belonged to Colonel Ralph Reynolds. Ralph Reynolds is he's 93 years old. Well, he'd be 95 years old now, and his wife would be 92. And they're still both with us, still sharp as can be. And the Tallahassee Lassie is painted up in his scheme that he had in World War II, and she was a beautiful lady, and she's still very beautiful. And
all right, now when you, 10 years ago, when there were a lot of World War II veterans that could come out here to see it, that were pilots, what kind of emotions did they have? Did they probably happy emotions and also sad, probably?
Well, it's a mix. Some of them are overjoyed to be able to get up close to the airplane. Some of them do get emotional and teary, touching it, getting close to it.
Yeah.
But it was an honor and a privilege for me to allow Ralph Reynolds to get up and climb into the Tallahassee Lassie, right, and sit in it, and that was very, very special for him and for his wife.
By the way, folks, if you're here tomorrow at 1 o'clock, John's daughter, Heather, is going to be here, and she is famous. You've all read about her. On September 11th, she was flying an F-16, and her job was to put down a civilian airline, and it was a very emotional thing. Is that correct?
That was a very interesting and very difficult day. Just a short story. She and her squadron mates were in their squadron at Andrews Air Force Base. The world was at peace. All of a sudden, somebody said, "Hey, come and look at this." Somebody just attacked one of the airplane crash in the World Trade Center. As things went on, okay, thank you. I'll let you take a look at that.
Yeah. Okay.
As time went on, they realized that we were under attack, and she and several of her pilot or squadron mates were just standing at the operations counter. The operations officer turned around, and Heather and her flight commander just happened to be standing there, said, "Heather, you and Sass go." So it wasn't like they searched her out. So she doesn't want to be described as a hero. She says she's an accidental witness to history that day. But they were both launched and vectored out towards United Flight 93. And they had no armament on board except for some ball ammo for ballast. So they would have had about a 1-second burst of the gun. So they may have had to ram the airframe to try to disable it to bring that aircraft down to keep it from coming into Washington, D.C. area. The airplane had already crashed, because, unbeknownst to them, because of all the confusion. But my wife, Stephanie, in the white shirt here.
That's Stephanie over there.
she and I are very, very proud of how she performed that day.
Thank you. Appreciate you bringing your airplane here. It's a beautiful airplane, and I'm sure you're proud to fly it.